Hi, I'm Mike Casey, and thanks for coming back for another edition of Scaling Green's Communicating Energy Lecture Series. This is the clean economy's ongoing conversation at the intersection of media and marketing and policy. And with us today is Richard Caperton. He is a nationally recognized energy finance expert. He works at the Center for American Progress, which is a very prominent think tank, but he also has done some service for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And he hails from both Missouri and Virginia. I've gotten to know him because of the Roundtable Coalition that he's put together and really driven around the effort to allow renewable energy sectors to get access to master limited partnerships, or MLPs, just like the oil and gas industry has been able to do for the last 30 years. So Richard, first, thank you for coming. And the second is, what is an MLP?
So a master limited partnership it's a business structure. It's not really a policy. It's when you organize a business, you can choose to be any number of things. You can be a C corporation or an S corporation or an LLC or an LLP or any number of dozens of other things. In this case, they all have different implications for how you're taxed and how you can raise money. And a master limited partnership has certain benefits. It's not taxed at the corporate level, so it's only one level of taxation. And second, it can raise money on public markets. So that's a huge advantage for the people who can use it. Right now, only the fossil fuel industry can use this structure. That's in the law. And what we want to do is just make it so that renewable energy and energy efficiency can share in those same benefits.
Let me see if I follow you. There's a
Yep.
lucrative tax break that only the oil and gas industry gets to use?
Surprise, surprise. What I do know is that some very back-of-the-envelope calculations on renewable energy say that lowering the cost of capital, and forgive me for getting technical a little bit here,
Okay.
lowering the cost of capital by 100 basis points, so say from 6% to 5%, would reduce the cost of rooftop solar by 40 cents a watt. So that is a dramatic cost reduction, and you could see where MLPs, if they lower it by 300 or 400 basis points, could have a huge impact.
Can you explain the difference between the PTC and MLPs? Apples to oranges or apples to apples?
So they're apples to oranges. The PTC, for two reasons. First is that they're just a different scale of value. The PTC is much more valuable to the wind industry than MLP treatment would be. That's why we can't get rid of the PTC. The second is that they operate differently. They have, they're treated differently. They're just different. They work very differently, so they're not immediately interchangeable. But that's a much more complicated point. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is 2.2 cents a kilowatt hour from the PTC is extremely valuable. It's a legitimate concern, and it's a concern that I share and a lot of other people have. The issue would be that there are people who don't like renewable energy, people like the American Petroleum Institute, who've still said very nice things about this bill that would make renewables eligible for MLPs. And there's a little bit of uncertainty about why exactly they're doing that. Are they doing it just to bring more people into the tent and make it easier to defend this policy in an era of tax reform? Or do they have more mischievous ideas, which are using it to say, well, now we've given you master limited partnerships, let's take away the production tax credit. Now, of course, they're not giving up any of their existing incentives to benefit from MLP, so it would definitely be a double standard to do that. The PTC and the ITC are much more valuable than MLP treatment will be for the industry as a whole. Now, there may be one or two companies that are subsets that would feel differently, but in general, we should definitely support the PTC and the ITC as fundamental drivers of investment that have been extremely successful, and we shouldn't do anything to get rid of those.
Do MLPs have a sunset date?
MLPs do not have a sunset date. That's a permanent thing, and that's a lot of the benefit for it is that the PTC will go away at some point unless we're successful, as we have been every time it expired. But we have to keep fighting that fight, whereas MLP is permanent, and that has some value. Same with the ITC. All of this, of course, would be impacted by comprehensive tax reform if that happens. There is a push among some people to just get rid of the MLP structure entirely because it's a hit to the corporate tax code. It reduces revenue to the government, and right now it reduces the revenue to the government by $1.5 billion a year just for the oil and gas companies that get it. So there is a push to just get rid of MLP treatment. If that happened, then the field would be level on this particular thing. we would have MLP parity one way or another.
So my question for you is, what leads you to think that these really powerful incumbent players like ExxonMobil are going to let MLPs become a vehicle that everybody gets to access as opposed to just them?
It's an interesting question, and I think there's two ways to think about it. First is, there's no reason to believe that the most profitable companies in the world are going to sit by while something comes that will threaten them. Now, at the same time, they've said positive things about MLPs, so that leads me to conclude that they don't think MLPs for clean energy are a threat to their underlying business. I think in many ways they see it as a benefit because it just brings more people into the tent and helps protect that status going forward.
Interesting. Okay, here's what I call the toll question that if you come on Communicating Energy, I'm probably going to ask you, which is, are you aware of a comprehensive inventory of all the ways in which we cut a welfare check to these highly profitable fossil fuel incumbent sectors?
They're the things that are easy to track, the tax benefits, and even those are a little bit hard, but basically they're in the tax code, they say who gets them, and the Joint Committee on Taxation scores them every year and sort of says, well, here's what it costs taxpayers. MLP treatment for fossil fuels costs us $1.5 billion a year. The advantages of things like liability caps on nuclear power plants from the Price-Anderson Act is extremely hard to quantify, and we don't have any idea what that really costs us or what the value is to the people who benefit. So it's actually worth about $1.5 billion a year to them. That's the cost to us, the taxpayers. So it's not a small number. That's a lot of money that we're just giving away to these people and only giving it to them. And there's no inherent reason that it should only be for fossil fuels. It just makes perfect sense to make it work for all the energy sectors. So let's be clear. The biggest thing that we have that gives an unfair advantage to fossil fuels is not pricing their emissions. They get to spew pollution into the air that hurts all of us, and they don't pay anything for it. We pay for it through our hospital bills, but they don't pay for it. If we don't do anything for that, we're never going to have a level playing field. Now, if we do price the carbon, then we should think about all the other tax incentives. Fossil fuels still get billions and billions of dollars in tax advantages every single year, and they also need to be gotten rid of. And the oil companies have a liability cap on how much they owe when they have a spill or some sort of disaster. They can only be forced to pay up to $75 million for those damages.
And who pays for the rest of the cleanup?
The taxpayers.
Has anybody actually got the number or the inventory?
Yes and no. Some people have done a very, very good job with it, but not in the last few years. The Environmental Law Institute in particular did a great survey of this and found massive spending in the fossil fuel sector. Also, a group called DBL Investors, a venture capital firm out of the Bay Area, did a report called What Would Jefferson Do? That looked at historic spending in the fossil fuel sector and the nuclear sector and the renewable sector, splitting out, I think, ethanol from renewable power like wind and solar. They found that fossil fuels had gotten, and I think the number is right, $80 of support for every $1 that renewables had gotten.
Billy Parrish at Solar Mosaic out in San Francisco, he is pioneering a crowdfunding model that's got a lot of attention and has a great track record so far. Will MLPs hurt or help what he's doing?
So I don't think they'll hurt or help. I think what the important thing to know here is that there are multiple ways that individuals can invest. You can invest through a crowdfunding effort like Solar Mosaic. You can invest through MLPs if we get MLP parity. You can invest in renewables by buying public shares in a company like First Solar. The lesson that I take away from Solar Mosaic is that there's a lot of demand from individuals across the country interested in renewable energy, people who understand that these are relatively safe investments and people who understand that they can do the right thing with their money. To me, that's promising for MLPs. It's promising for the whole sector because people like to make money, and the fact that they're doing it means that they will take advantage of these tools. The divestment campaign is a big deal. This is a Bill McKibben thing to get universities and colleges to take their endowments out of fossil fuels. The biggest 500 universities have about a $400 billion endowment in total. and that's about what ExxonMobil is worth today. So they're sort of on the same scale, the scale that could make a difference. Unfortunately, because endowments have some special rules, they're tax exempt and the way they're managed, they can't really invest in MLPs. They don't really benefit from investing in MLPs. Thankfully though, because of the question you raised earlier, there are all sorts of other tools that they can use to invest in clean energy. So endowments can take their money out of fossil fuels, make a big difference to the fossil fuel industry, and they can invest it in renewable energy via crowdfunding. They can do it via publicly traded companies. And they actually, unlike us, have access to the private equity firms that do these investments too. So they can make a lot of profitable investments in that sector.
What is your reaction to the argument against the divestment campaign that there really aren't comparable investment vehicles, or I should say investment opportunities for universities if they're going to get out of the fossil fuel business?
So those are very profitable companies, but they're also very large companies. So is the profitability just a factor of how big they are? I think that's got a lot to do with it, and that's the eye-popping numbers. But they are profitable businesses. But renewable energy is growing. It's a safe investment. A wind turbine with a 20-year power purchase agreement with a credit-worthy utility is a very safe, very stable, and actually pretty lucrative investment.
What do you make of the conversation that seems so unbalanced because it's being driven by the heavily subsidized about the problems with the lightly subsidized?
They have done a very, very good job of turning the conversation around and making renewables less popular than they should be, especially on Capitol Hill. Now, if you go out to the general American public, the public is extremely supportive of clean energy, very supportive of dealing with climate change, very supportive of the economic development and clean air that comes from these investments in clean energy. But you go up on Capitol Hill and it's a different story. It's people talking about drill baby drill and various updates of that. But it's a tough time in Washington, D.C. for national legislation because of that.
As clean energy communicators, what's the fundamental value we want to communicate about MLPs, and what's the fundamental value of communicating about MLPs?
Fairness. And that point sells very well on Capitol Hill. People on both sides of the aisle like this point, and I think it's very effective. Now, with strong environmental advocates, that's not the most exciting thing for them to hear. And I think this is a point where your audience really matters, and for them, I think it's affordability of clean energy. And that's the emotional way to explain it for communicators, is that it's these people are taking our money, they're taking our resource, and then they're profiting from it in a way that you and I can't profit from. It's unfair, and it's especially unfair because it's a resource that's poisoning the air and causing climate change. And it's especially unfair beyond those because it's not available to everybody. And the way you can sell MLPs is that this is a logical step that renewable energy can benefit. I would also add that we can't be afraid of talking about tax policy. Energy policy is tax policy for the most part in the United States, and we need to find ways to communicate it better. The MLP Parity Act has bipartisan, bicameral support, but that doesn't mean it's clear that it's going to get passed by the House, passed by the Senate, go to a conference committee, and then get sent to the President for him to sign it. We need a lot more advocacy work done on this, and we need a lot more grassroots engagement on the fact that this is a tax incentive that is unfair right now and can be made fair, and that can make a difference for clean energy. I mean, and on the point about, just a bigger point about clean energy financing, we need to spend $1 trillion in clean energy over the next several decades, at least. Now, $1 trillion is a lot of money. I can't picture what $1 trillion looks like. So just break it down by year. You need to spend, say, $50 billion a year. Getting $50 billion a year in capital investment requires using every tool we have. If we use every tool, if we use all the government credit programs, if we use all the tax incentives, and then if we use MLPs, and if we use crowdfunding, and if we use utility balance sheets, and if we use regular publicly traded companies, and if we securitize the debt, if we do everything there is then that capital will be available. But if we put artificial constraints on it, then that capital won't be available and we'll have a problem.